Betty Wilson had always dreamed of living in a perfect neighborhood. After spending 30 years climbing the corporate ladder at a major insurance company, she finally had enough money saved up to buy her dream home in Meadowbrook Estates. The gated community promised everything she wanted: pristine sidewalks, matching mailboxes, and neighbors who understood the importance of keeping up appearances. Moving day came on a crisp October morning. Betty stood in front of her brand-new, two-story colonial house, admiring the freshly painted shutters and perfectly manicured lawn that came with the property. Everything looked exactly like the glossy brochures had promised. The HOA fees were steep at $400 a month, but Betty considered it money well spent for maintaining their slice of suburban paradise. That first evening, as Betty unpacked her china collection in the dining room, she heard something that made her freeze. It was a low, rumbling sound that seemed completely out of place in her upscale neighborhood. She peered through her brand-new curtains and saw something that made her heart sink. Right next door, separated only by a wooden fence, was what looked like a working farm. The property was nothing like the neat suburban lots surrounding it. Instead of a manicured lawn, there were open fields stretching back toward a line of old oak trees. A weathered farmhouse sat in the middle of it all, its paint peeling and its front porch sagging slightly. But what really caught Betty's attention were the black and brown cows scattered across the pasture, casually munching grass as if they belonged there. Betty grabbed her phone and immediately called the real estate agent who had sold her the house. "Linda, there seems to be some kind of mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "There's a farm right next to my new house, actual cows. This can't be right." Linda's voice carried a hint of nervousness. "Oh, that's the Mitchell property. Don't worry, Betty, it's been there for years. Most buyers actually find it charming," gives the area character. "Charming?" Betty's voice rose an octave. "I paid $500,000 for a house in a premium development, and nobody thought to mention there was a barnyard next door." After hanging up in frustration, Betty spent the rest of the evening researching everything she could find about her new neighbor. The property records showed that Tom Mitchell had owned his 40 acres since the early 2000s, long before Meadowbrook Estates was even a concept. He raised about 50 head of cattle and grew hay on the back portion of his land. The next morning brought Betty's first real taste of country living. At exactly 5:30 a.m., she was jolted awake by the sound of a diesel engine rumbling to life. Through her bedroom window, she watched in horror as Tom loaded hay bales onto an old pickup truck. The cows had gathered near the fence line, and their occasional mooing drifted across her pristine backyard. Betty marched outside in her silk pajamas and fuzzy slippers, determined to introduce herself and establish some ground rules. She found Tom near the fence checking the water trough for his cattle. He was a man in his early 60s wearing faded jeans and a worn baseball cap, his weathered hands showing decades of outdoor work. "Excuse me," Betty called out, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she'd perfected in countless boardroom meetings. "I'm Betty Wilson, your new neighbor. I think we need to talk about your operation here." Tom looked up with a friendly smile and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Tom Mitchell. Sorry about the early start. Cattle don't understand weekends, I'm afraid." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss," Betty said, crossing her arms. "The noise from your equipment is quite disruptive, and the smell—" She wrinkled her nose dramatically. "Surely there are regulations about operating a commercial farm so close to residential property." Tom's smile faded slightly, but his voice remained patient. "Well, ma'am, this isn't really a commercial operation, just a small cattle ranch, and we've been here since 2003. All the permits are up to date with the county." "But this is Meadowbrook Estates," Betty insisted. "We have standards here, property values to maintain. I'm sure if you looked into it, you'd find there are HOA guidelines that cover this sort of thing." "The HOA doesn't have any authority over my property," Tom explained gently. "My land was grandfathered in when they built the development. Always been agricultural use." Betty spent the rest of that day on the phone with the HOA management company, the county planning office, and anyone else who might help her understand how this situation was possible. Each conversation left her more frustrated than the last. Everyone gave her the same basic answer: Tom's ranch was legal, established, and protected by agricultural zoning laws. Over the following weeks, Betty documented every aspect of Tom's daily routine that bothered her. She kept a detailed journal, noting the times his equipment started up, the volume of the cattle's mooing, and what she considered the offensive agricultural odors that occasionally drifted over her property line. The problems seemed to multiply in Betty's mind. When Tom's cattle gathered near the fence to seek shade under the oak trees, she saw it as a deliberate attempt to annoy her. When he used his tractor to spread fertilizer on his hayfields, she was convinced he was targeting her specifically, with the smell. The sight of his old pickup truck and farm equipment parked in the driveway struck her as a personal insult to the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Betty began recruiting allies among her new neighbors. She knocked on doors throughout Meadowbrook Estates armed with printed photos of Tom's property and a petition demanding action from the HOA board. Some neighbors sympathized with her frustration, while others seemed puzzled by her intensity about the issue. "I just don't understand why this is such a big problem," said her neighbor across the street, an elderly retired teacher named Mrs. Chen. "The ranch was here when we moved in 5 years ago. We actually enjoy watching the cattle. It's peaceful." But Betty found enough supporters to feel validated in her mission. Several newer residents shared her vision of what their neighborhood should look like, and they were equally dismayed to discover they'd moved next to working farmland. The breaking point came during Betty's first HOA board meeting. She had prepared a detailed presentation complete with photographs, noise level measurements she'd taken with a phone app, and a list of what she called quality of life violations caused by Tom's ranch. She stood before the 5-member board in the community clubhouse, confident that reasonable people would see her side of the issue. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we have a serious problem that threatens everything Meadowbrook Estates represents. This agricultural operation is completely incompatible with our community standards." The board members listened politely as Betty outlined her complaints, but their response was not what she'd expected. The board president, a local attorney, explained patiently that they had no legal authority over Tom's property. The ranch predated their community, operated under proper permits, and was protected by state agricultural protection laws. "But surely, there's something we can do," Betty insisted. "This can't be legal. Nobody would develop a premium community next to a cattle ranch." "Actually, Mrs. Wilson," the attorney replied, "the developers were well aware of Mr. Mitchell's property. It's all disclosed in the community documents you signed when you purchased your home." Betty left that meeting feeling betrayed and determined to find another solution. If the HOA couldn't help her, she would have to find someone who could. She spent her evenings researching county regulations, state agriculture laws, and any possible violation she might be able to use to force Tom to change his operation or move elsewhere. The war between suburban perfection and rural tradition was just beginning, and Betty Wilson was preparing for battle. Betty Wilson wasn't the type of person who gave up easily. After that disappointing HOA meeting, she went home and spread all her research materials across her dining room table like a general planning a military campaign. If the Homeowners Association couldn't help her, she would find other ways to deal with the Tom Mitchell problem. The next morning, Betty called the county health department. She put on her most concerned citizen voice and explained that she was worried about potential health hazards from the cattle operation next door. "I'm just concerned about groundwater contamination," she told the health inspector. "And there are so many flies. Surely that can't be sanitary with all these families and children living so close by." The health department scheduled an inspection for the following week. Betty felt a surge of satisfaction as she hung up the phone. Finally, someone was taking her concerns seriously. While waiting for the inspection, Betty decided to document everything more thoroughly. She bought a professional-looking camera and started taking pictures of Tom's property from every angle she could manage without actually trespassing. She photographed the cattle near the fence, the farm equipment in his driveway, and what she considered unsightly aspects of his operation. Betty also started a neighborhood email list, sending daily updates about what she called the agricultural situation to anyone who would listen. Her emails were detailed reports of every sound, smell, and sight that bothered her. 6:15 a.m., Diesel engine started up, disturbing peaceful morning atmosphere. 6:45 a.m., strong barnyard odor detected in backyard. 7:30 a.m., loud mooing disrupted. My morning coffee on the patio. Some neighbors started avoiding Betty when they saw her coming. Others, however, were drawn into her crusade. The Hendersons, who lived 2 houses down, had teenage daughters who complained that the smell sometimes drifted over during their pool parties. The Patels, new residents like Betty, worried that the ranch might hurt their property values when it came time to sell. Betty organized her supporters into what she called the Meadowbrook Quality of Life Committee. They held meetings in her living room every Thursday evening, sharing stories about how Tom's ranch was ruining their suburban dream. The group started making phone calls to various government agencies, hoping someone would find a violation they could use. The county health inspection came and went without the results Betty had hoped for. The inspector found Tom's operation completely compliant with all health regulations. His cattle had proper access to clean water, the manure was managed according to agricultural best practices, and there were no environmental violations. The inspector's report actually praised Tom for maintaining his property well above minimum standards. Betty wasn't discouraged. She filed a complaint with the county's code enforcement office, claiming that Tom's farm equipment was illegally parked in a residential area. When that was dismissed because his property was zoned agricultural, she complained to the state environmental agency about potential water pollution from livestock runoff. Each failed complaint only made Betty more determined. She started driving around the county, looking for other ranches and farms, hoping to find violations she could use as examples of what Tom might be doing wrong. She spent hours at the county courthouse, poring over land use records and zoning maps, looking for any technicality that might help her case. Tom, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. Betty's photography sessions from her backyard were obvious and unsettling. Sometimes he would look up from feeding his cattle to see her standing at her fence with that big camera, taking pictures of him working. Her constant presence made him feel like he was being watched and judged for simply doing the work he'd been doing for 20 years. The situation got worse when Betty started following Tom around town. She claimed it was coincidence, but Tom noticed her car behind him when he drove to the feed store, the veterinarian's office, and even the grocery store. Betty told her neighbors she was monitoring his activities to see if he was violating any transportation regulations with his livestock trailer. Betty's campaign expanded beyond just Tom's property. She researched every aspect of his life that was public record. She found out he was divorced, that he had grown children who lived in other states, and that he had worked as a mechanic before inheriting the ranch from his uncle. She shared these details with her committee, as if Tom's personal life somehow supported her case against his farming operation. The breaking point came when Betty discovered that Tom occasionally sold a few cattle to local buyers. She was convinced this proved his operation was more commercial than he claimed. Betty spent hours researching agricultural sales regulations, hoping to find some permit or license Tom was missing. She called the state agriculture department and reported Tom for illegal commercial cattle sales without proper business licensing. She filed complaints with the IRS, suggesting he might not be reporting his farm income properly. Betty even contacted the state veterinarian's office, claiming she was concerned about the health certificates for cattle being sold from Tom's ranch. Each agency that investigated found Tom's operation completely legal and properly documented. His cattle sales were small-scale and fully reported. All his livestock health records were up to date. His business license and tax filings were in perfect order. But Betty's complaints were creating a paper trail that was starting to attract attention from local officials who wondered why one neighbor was so determined to find problems with a ranch that had operated without incident for decades. Tom tried to address the situation directly. One evening, he walked over to Betty's house and knocked on her front door. When she answered, he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, trying to be as respectful as possible. "Mrs. Wilson," he said quietly, "I know you're not happy about living next to my ranch. Is there anything we can work out? Maybe some kind of compromise that would help us both be better neighbors?" Betty crossed her arms and looked at him coldly. "The only compromise I'm interested in, Mr. Mitchell, is you finding somewhere else to keep your cattle. This is a residential neighborhood now. Your operation doesn't belong here anymore. But ma'am, this has been my home for over 20 years. I can't just pack up and move because you don't like having a ranch next door. I've got everything I own tied up in this place. That's not my problem, Betty replied. Progress means change. Sometimes people have to adapt to new realities. Tom walked back to his house feeling defeated. He had tried to be reasonable, but it was clear that Betty wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than his complete departure from the property his family had owned for decades. Betty, meanwhile, felt energized by the confrontation. She interpreted Tom's attempt at compromise as a sign of weakness, proof that her pressure campaign was working. She decided it was time to escalate her efforts even further. That night, Betty called an emergency meeting of her quality of life committee. She told her supporters that it was time to take more serious action. Tom's ranch was clearly a threat to their community, and if the government agencies wouldn't help them, they would have to find other ways to protect their neighborhood from what she called agricultural encroachment. The war between Betty and Tom was about to enter a much more dangerous phase. Saturday morning started like any other for Tom Mitchell. He woke up at dawn, made his coffee, and headed out to check on his cattle. It was the kind of peaceful spring morning he'd always loved about ranch life. Cool air, birds singing, and the quiet satisfaction of taking care of his animals. Tom had planned to move his cattle from the north pasture to the south field that day. It was routine maintenance, something he did several times a year to keep the grass healthy and give different areas time to recover. He'd built a narrow fenced corridor years ago that connected his pastures, allowing the cattle to move safely from one area to another without ever leaving his property. What Tom didn't know was that Betty Wilson had been watching his every move for weeks, waiting for what she was convinced would be the perfect opportunity to catch him doing something wrong. She had her camera ready, her phone charged, and a notebook full of complaints she'd been building up for months. Betty had been getting more frustrated with each failed attempt to get Tom in trouble with various government agencies. Every inspection came back clean. Every complaint was dismissed. Her neighbors were starting to lose interest in her crusade, and even her quality of life committee meetings were getting smaller as people grew tired of her constant anger about the ranch next door. But that Saturday morning, Betty was convinced her patience was finally going to pay off. From her kitchen window, Betty watched Tom opening gates and preparing to move his cattle. She saw him walking along the fence line, checking the temporary barriers he used to guide the animals. To Tom, it was just another day of normal ranch work. To Betty, it looked like the beginning of a crisis she could finally use to her advantage. Betty grabbed her phone and started recording as Tom opened the gate between pastures. His cattle, familiar with the routine, began walking slowly along the fenced corridor toward their new grazing area. They moved calmly, the way cattle do when they're not stressed or frightened. The lead cow, an older animal Tom called Bessie, knew the route well and led the others at a steady pace. But Betty saw something completely different. In her mind, those cattle weren't being moved safely between pastures. They were running loose and creating a dangerous situation. She watched them walking peacefully along the fenced path and somehow convinced herself she was witnessing an emergency. Betty's hands shook as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Betty's voice was high and panicked. "I need police and animal control immediately," she said, trying to sound as urgent as possible. "There are dangerous livestock running loose in our neighborhood. They're threatening people. This is a real emergency." The dispatcher asked for more details. "Ma'am, can you describe what you're seeing? Are the animals actually loose or are they contained?" Betty looked out her window at the cattle walking calmly along Tom's fenced corridor. They're moving around everywhere," she said, stretching the truth as far as she dared. "There are people jogging in this neighborhood. Children ride their bikes here. These animals could attack someone. They're huge and unpredictable." "Are you seeing the animals outside of any fencing, ma'am? Are they on public property?" Betty hesitated for just a moment. She could see the cattle were clearly inside Tom's fenced area, but she was too invested in her story to back down now. "Listen, I don't think you understand how serious this is. These are massive animals and they're agitated. Someone could get seriously hurt. We need help right now. The dispatcher, trained to err on the side of caution when it came to public safety, sent out multiple units. 2 police cars, an animal control truck, and even a fire department vehicle were dispatched to what the system logged as a livestock emergency with potential public danger. Meanwhile, Tom was completely unaware of the chaos brewing around him. He was focused on making sure his cattle moved safely to their new pasture. A few neighbors had come out to watch, not because they were concerned, but because they actually enjoyed seeing the cattle. Mrs. Chen from across the street was taking pictures to send to her grandchildren, who always got excited about seeing the moo cows when they visited. Tom noticed a jogger had stopped to watch the cattle move. Instead of looking frightened, the woman was smiling and taking pictures with her phone. 2 kids on bicycles had also stopped to watch, their parents standing nearby. Everyone seemed relaxed and interested, not scared or threatened. That's when Tom heard the sirens. At first, he figured the emergency vehicles were heading somewhere else, but as the sound got louder and closer, Tom felt a growing sense of dread. When the first police car turned into Meadowbrook Estates with its lights flashing, followed by animal control and a fire truck, Tom's stomach dropped. Officer Rodriguez was the first to arrive. He jumped out of his patrol car expecting to find chaos. Loose cattle stampeding through a suburban neighborhood, people running for safety, maybe injured civilians. Instead, he saw about 30 cattle walking slowly and peacefully along a clearly marked fence line, supervised by a calm-looking man in work clothes. "Are you the property owner?" Officer Rodriguez asked Tom, looking around for signs of the emergency that had been reported. "Yes, sir, I'm Tom Mitchell. Is there some kind of problem?" Officer Rodriguez looked at the cattle, then at Tom, then back at the cattle. "We got a call about dangerous livestock running loose, threatening public safety. But these animals look like they're contained to me." More emergency vehicles arrived, their sirens creating a neighborhood spectacle that drew curious residents from their houses. Betty watched from her window, expecting to see Tom arrested or at least cited for whatever violations she was sure the authorities would find. But as the minutes passed, Betty began to realize that things weren't going according to her plan. The police officers were talking calmly with Tom, not handcuffing him. The animal control officer was actually petting one of the cattle through the fence. The firefighters looked confused about why they'd been called to what was obviously a routine cattle operation. Officer Rodriguez walked the fence line, documenting everything with his body camera. He could see that the cattle were completely contained within the property boundaries, moving along a purpose-built corridor from one fenced area to another. There was no public danger, no loose animals, and no emergency of any kind. "Sir, can you tell me who called this in?" Tom asked, though he had a pretty good idea already. Officer Rodriguez pointed toward Betty's house. "The call came from your neighbor over there. She seemed very concerned about public safety." Tom sighed deeply. He'd known this day would probably come, given Betty's escalating campaign against his ranch. But he hadn't expected her to call in, a fake emergency just to cause him trouble. As the other emergency responders began to realize they'd been called out on a false alarm, their attention turned toward Betty's house. Officer Rodriguez decided it was time to get the full story about what had really happened that morning. The cattle, completely unbothered by all the excitement, continued their peaceful journey to the south pasture. They had no idea they'd just become the center of a drama that was about to change everything for both Tom and Betty. Officer Rodriguez walked toward Betty's front door, his body camera still recording, ready to find out why someone had reported a livestock emergency that clearly didn't exist. Officer Rodriguez walked up to Betty's front door with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. Behind him, the other emergency responders were packing up their equipment, shaking their heads at what was clearly a waste of taxpayer resources. The fire truck was already pulling away, and the animal control officer was having a friendly conversation with Tom about his cattle breeding program. Betty had been watching from her window, expecting to see Tom being arrested, or at least heavily fined for whatever violations she was sure the authorities would discover. Instead, she watched in growing panic as it became obvious that the emergency responders weren't finding any problems with Tom's operation. When Officer Rodriguez knocked on her door, Betty took a deep breath and tried to compose herself. She had to make them understand how serious the situation really was, even if they couldn't see it from their perspective. "Mrs. Wilson?" Officer Rodriguez said when Betty opened the door. "I'm Officer Rodriguez. You called 911 about a livestock emergency?" "Yes, absolutely," Betty said, trying to sound confident. "Those animals were completely out of control. Someone could have been seriously hurt." Officer Rodriguez looked back toward Tom's property, where the cattle were now peacefully grazing in their new pasture. "Ma'am, I've been observing the situation for about 20 minutes now. The cattle appear to be contained within fenced areas on Mr. Mitchell's property. Can you help me understand what emergency you witnessed?" Betty felt her first flutter of real nervousness, but she pushed ahead with her story. "Officer, you don't understand. Those animals were running everywhere. They were agitated and dangerous. I saw joggers having to dodge them." "Where exactly did you see joggers being threatened, ma'am?" "I've spoken with several people who were in the area, and they all described the cattle as calm and contained." Betty's mind raced. She had exaggerated the situation when she called 911, but now she was committed to her version of events. "Well, maybe the joggers had already left by the time you got here. But the threat was real. Those animals could have broken through the fence at any moment." Officer Rodriguez made notes in his pad while his body camera continued recording. "Mrs. Wilson, have you had any previous issues with Mr. Mitchell's cattle operation?" This was Betty's chance to make her case. "Officer, I've been documenting problems with this operation for months. The noise, the smells, the complete disregard for neighborhood standards. This morning was just the final straw." "So you've made other complaints about Mr. Mitchell's property?" "Of course I have. I've contacted the County Health Department Code Enforcement, the State Agriculture Office, the EPA, everyone who should be regulating this kind of operation in a residential area." Officer Rodriguez looked up from his notepad. "And what were the results of those complaints?" Betty hesitated. She couldn't exactly admit that every single complaint had been dismissed, but she also couldn't lie to a police officer. "Well, these government agencies don't always understand the full impact of agricultural operations on residential communities. Mrs. Wilson, I need to ask you directly. When you called 911 this morning, did you actually see cattle outside of the fenced areas on Mr. Mitchell's property?" Betty felt trapped. She could see that Officer Rodriguez wasn't buying her story, but she couldn't back down now without admitting she had lied. "The situation was dangerous," she insisted. "Maybe the animals were technically inside fences, but they were agitated and unpredictable. Ma'am, I observed the cattle for an extended period. They appeared calm and were moving in an orderly fashion under Mr. Mitchell's supervision. Did you see anything specific that made you believe they were agitated?" Betty's story was falling apart and she could feel it. "Look, officer, maybe I was mistaken about some of the details, but I was genuinely concerned about public safety. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" That's when Officer Rodriguez realized what had really happened. This wasn't an emergency call from a concerned citizen. It was harassment disguised as a public safety report. He had seen cases like this before, where neighbor disputes escalated to the point where people started making false reports to get authorities involved in their personal conflicts. "Mrs. Wilson," Officer Rodriguez said, his tone becoming more serious, "filing a false police report is a criminal offense. When someone calls 911 and reports an emergency that doesn't exist, it wastes valuable resources and could delay response to real emergencies." Betty felt the blood drain from her face. "I didn't file a false report. I was genuinely concerned. Based on my investigation, there was no livestock emergency, no public danger, and no animals outside of properly maintained fencing. Mr. Mitchell's operation appears to be completely legal and properly managed." Officer Rodriguez walked back to his patrol car and radioed for his supervisor. This situation was more complicated than a simple false report. It looked like part of an ongoing harassment campaign that might require additional investigation. While waiting for his supervisor, Officer Rodriguez decided to get more information from Tom about the history of complaints and problems with his neighbor. Tom explained the months of harassment, the constant photography, the multiple government inspections, and Betty's attempts to get him shut down through various agencies. "She even followed me around town a few times," Tom told the officer. "Maid," Me real uncomfortable. I tried talking to her directly, tried to work out some kind of compromise, but she made it clear she just wants me gone. Officer Rodriguez requested copies of all the complaints Betty had filed against Tom over the past several months. What he discovered was a pattern of escalating harassment, disguised as legitimate concerns. Betty had filed over 30 separate complaints with various agencies in just 4 months, far more than any reasonable neighbor would make about genuine safety issues. When the supervisor arrived, Officer Rodriguez briefed him on the situation. Together they reviewed the evidence: multiple false complaints, harassment of a neighbor, and now a fake emergency call that had wasted significant public resources. The supervisor decided to have a more serious conversation with Betty about the legal consequences of her actions. When they knocked on her door again, Betty answered with obvious anxiety. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Sergeant Thompson. We need to discuss the pattern of complaints you've been making about your neighbor's property." Betty tried to maintain her innocent act. "I've only been trying to protect our neighborhood. If that's wrong, then I don't understand what kind of community we're supposed to be." "Ma'am, filing multiple false reports is harassment. Calling 911 when there's no actual emergency is a crime. You've wasted hundreds of hours of government time and taxpayer money on complaints that have all been determined to be unfounded. But his operation really is a problem," Betty insisted. "Just because these agencies can't see it doesn't mean the problems don't exist." Sergeant Thompson looked at Betty seriously. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm going to be very clear with you. If we receive any more false reports from you about Mr. Mitchell's property, you will be arrested and charged. Do you understand?" Betty felt her world crashing down around her. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was the victim here, the one trying to protect her neighborhood from an inappropriate agricultural operation. How had she become the one being threatened with arrest? "I understand," she said quietly, but inside she was already thinking about what she could do next. There had to be some way to make people see that Tom's ranch didn't belong in their community. As the police officers left, Betty realized that her campaign against Tom had not only failed, it had backfired completely. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. Betty Wilson should have taken the police warning seriously, but she was too angry and humiliated to think clearly. After the officers left, she sat in her living room staring at Tom's ranch through her window, feeling like the whole world had turned against her. In her mind, she wasn't the problem. Everyone else just couldn't see what was obvious to her. The next few days were a nightmare for Betty. Word spread quickly through Meadowbrook Estates about the false emergency call and the police investigation. Her neighbors, who had initially been sympathetic to her complaints about farm smells and noise, now saw her differently. The story of how she had called in a fake livestock emergency made her look ridiculous and vindictive. Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher who lived across the street, stopped by to talk to Betty. "I heard what happened on Saturday," she said gently. "Betty, Tom Mitchell is a good man. His ranch has been here longer than any of our houses. Maybe it's time to accept that and try to be a better neighbor." But Betty couldn't accept it. She spent hours online, researching agricultural laws and looking for any angle she might have missed. She found obscure regulations about livestock transportation, water usage, and even historical property rights. She was convinced that if she dug deep enough, she would find the legal weapon she needed to force Tom out. 2 weeks after the police incident, Betty discovered what she thought was her smoking gun. She found a county ordinance about commercial vehicle parking in residential areas. Tom's livestock trailer, which he used to haul cattle to the veterinarian or occasionally transport an animal to a buyer, was parked in his driveway. Betty was certain this violated the commercial vehicle restriction. Despite the police warning, Betty called the county code enforcement office one more time. She reported Tom for illegally parking commercial equipment in a residential area. But this complaint backfired even worse than her 911 call. The code enforcement officer who came to investigate recognized Betty's address from the stack of previous complaints in Tom's file. When he saw the livestock trailer parked on agricultural property that was properly zoned for such equipment, he realized this was another harassment complaint from the same neighbor who had been causing problems for months. Instead of citing Tom, the code enforcement officer filed a formal harassment complaint against Betty. The county prosecutor's office, already aware of Betty's pattern of false reports, decided it was time to take action. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, Betty answered her door to find 2 police officers with an arrest warrant. She was charged with filing false police reports, criminal harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The charges were serious enough to potentially result in jail time and heavy fines. The arrest made the local news. A reporter from the county newspaper had been following the story of the suburban woman who kept filing complaints against her rancher neighbor. When Betty was arrested, the story exploded on social media. The headline read, "Local woman arrested for harassing neighbor's legal ranch operation." The article detailed Betty's months-long campaign of complaints, the false emergency call, and her eventual arrest. The story was picked up by regional news outlets and shared thousands of times online. Betty became the face of entitled suburban behavior. Social media users shared the story with comments about how some people expected the world to change just for them. Memes were created showing Betty's mugshot next to pictures of peaceful cattle with captions like, "Dangerous livestock threatens suburban peace." The negative publicity was devastating for Betty. Her former colleagues at the insurance company saw the news coverage. Her neighbors avoided her completely now. Even her own family was embarrassed by the attention she had brought on herself. The legal consequences were just the beginning of Betty's problems. The HOA board, which had initially tried to stay neutral in the conflict, called an emergency meeting to address the situation. The negative media coverage was making Meadowbrook estates look bad, and property values were actually being hurt by the association with Betty's behavior, rather than by Tom's ranch. The HOA board voted unanimously to fine Betty for bringing negative attention to the community and to remove her from all committee positions. They also issued a formal statement supporting Tom's right to operate his ranch and apologizing for any problems caused by one resident's inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, something wonderful was happening for Tom. The media coverage had brought him unexpected support from the community. People who had never heard of his ranch before were now stopping by to buy fresh beef directly from him. Local restaurants reached out about supplying them with locally raised cattle. A crowdfunding campaign started by someone who saw the news story raised over $15,000 to help Tom with legal expenses and ranch improvements. The campaign description read, "Help a hard-working rancher who has been harassed by an entitled neighbor just for doing the work his family has done for decades." Tom was overwhelmed by the support. "I never expected anything like this," he told a reporter. "I just wanted to raise my cattle in peace and be a good neighbor. All this attention makes me uncomfortable, but I'm grateful that people understand I wasn't doing anything wrong." The story had a ripple effect throughout the county. Other longtime farmers and ranchers who had faced similar pressure from suburban development felt encouraged to stand up for their rights. Agricultural protection advocates used Tom's case as an example of why rural land use protections were important. Betty's legal troubles continued to mount. In addition to the criminal charges, Tom filed a civil lawsuit against her for harassment and interference with his business. His lawyer argued that Betty's false complaints had cost Tom time and money defending his legal operation against frivolous allegations. The civil case revealed the full extent of Betty's obsession with Tom's ranch. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had been genuinely concerned about property values and quality of life, but the evidence showed a pattern of harassment that went far beyond reasonable neighbor complaints. Phone records showed Betty had made over 200 calls to various government agencies about Tom's ranch. Her computer files, obtained through legal discovery, contained hundreds of photos of Tom's property and detailed logs of his daily activities. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had become dangerously obsessed with controlling her neighbor's legal activities. In the end, Betty faced serious consequences for her actions. She was convicted on the criminal charges and sentenced to 6 months of probation, community service, and a significant fine. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment against her for Tom's legal expenses and damages. The financial pressure from the legal costs, combined with the social isolation from her neighbors and the ongoing negative publicity, finally convinced Betty to put her house up for sale. She sold it for less than she had paid, partly because buyers were put off by the notorious address and partly because she needed to settle quickly to pay her legal debts. Betty moved to a different city, far from any agricultural operations. Her dream of suburban perfection had turned into a nightmare of her own making. Tom continued ranching on the land his family had owned for decades, now with the full support of his community and legal protections that would prevent future harassment. The whole experience had taught him that sometimes standing up for what's right means enduring difficult times, but that good people will eventually see the truth. The cattle, oblivious to all the human drama that had swirled around them, continued, grazing peacefully in their pastures, just as they had been doing all along.